itself, it was a little mad village because it had everything there. It had laundries and kitchens and hairdressers and seamstresses. It had everything there was on site. It was a mad village, and it was a total institution. So once you were in there, it was sort of custodial in its care for you, and you did lose life skills because you were there in a total environment where you were just utterly involved in it. And so for those 7 admissions, they range from weeks to months. And back in those days, people would say to you, never be put in Larundel, you'll never get out. And in a way it was true. Once you were there, you weren't there for days, it was weeks and months. And of course you had the back wards at Larundel, where people had been there for years, in these really grim places where not much happened for their lives. They sat around the edges of the wall in these vinyl chairs and were sort of over-medicated and lost to the world. So it was quite grim in that way. But then you had the open wards where there was rehabilitation taking place. And you had specialist wards too, like there was a place called the Hoddle Unit, which was a specialist unit for people with schizophrenia for intensive rehabilitation. So it was a mixed place. It was a very contradictory place, a very paradoxical place, and one that I found endlessly interesting, even though I was quite mad when I was there. But I want to read a poem about Larundel that I did write as a response to walking around the grounds and seeing all the vandalism that's taken place there now. It's just vandalised. It's falling. It's in disarray. It's ruined. It's just a ruination, really. And the other parts of it have been developed as a shopping centre. And of course, all the grounds that were just vast at the time are now endless suburban developments. So all those beautiful gardens that were there at Larundel, the gum trees, the rose bushes, the lawns, the shrubs, all gone and all being consumed by this development. So I wrote this poem in response to walking around the grounds of Larundel in its ruination, and it's called Alice in Larundel Land. Alice fell down a rabbit hole and landed in topsy-turvy Larundel Land, locked up, captive to lunacy, and a passing parade of mad hatters and March hares, eccentrics and musos and artists and a poet or two, and ordinary folk with the deepest sorrows, an inconceivable lunacy, sharing delusions like needles, voices babbling in the background, ECT before breakfast, Stelazine for lunch, Prothydon for dinner, Malorol at supper time, and to bed with a hallucination and a moggy. That's a mogadon, not a cat. A place full of hunger for kindness, friendship, love, a curious secluded world, its dark side kept well hidden. Shadow-haunted inmates longing for peace with themselves, no one knowing the wars that raged within, or the deep pain wedged between spirit and flesh, destroying lives, friends and family picking up the pieces. Larundel Land's red brick walls now rubble, windows shattered, graffiti telling another story, a playground for vandals and urban explorers. Once peaceful gardens dismembered. Sombre ghosts roam the precinct, calling us to remember them. We will remember you sitting in smoky rooms, crying alone, laughing with deranged angels, muddled and paranoid, chaotic and manic, anarchic and confused. Prisoners stalking locked wards, keys jangling, medication trolleys rumbling into melancholic rooms, and the humour, the blacker than black humour, the cut through all the crap and misery humour. You will not be forgotten. We shall erect a monument to commemorate all who passed through Larundel Land. We will remember the hellhole and sanctuary, the bottomless pit of despair, unexpected place of healing. Alice landed on her head in upside-down Larundel Land, the madhouse that once stood on the edge of town, where time dawdled and everyone hid in the shadows.
It's a great poem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you. So that's Larundel. It was a paradoxical place, but for me it was a huge part of my life, and I can't forget it. I can't forget my time there. I can't forget the people I saw there, the bad things I saw, the good things I saw, the wards where I stalked and pondered and walked around as a shadow, really. I thought, how can I write a history of Larundel? I thought, I'm not a historian, so I can't write a history of Larundel, but I thought I really want to interview people who were there as past inmates and past staff. So I started collecting people's names, and I started interviewing people in 2011. I did the first interviews, and then I kept interviewing, and I had, by about 2016, I had about 70 people I'd interviewed face to face, and there was a mountain of transcripts to be done, and I had started doing them, and it was just overwhelming. I thought, I can't do this,
What
it's
have I got
just too
myself
much.
into?
Yeah,
I know,
exactly.
what do you do? I mean, it's just mountains of, so I thought, okay, I've got to get this thing done. Who would be a great person to enlist in this project, to drag into it, and be a co-author? So I thought, oh, I know, the perfect person, Margie Leggatt. So I phoned a friend, and Margie picked up the phone, and I said, Margie, do you want to be a co-author of a book about Larundel? I thought, you've got a great background, you've got all that knowledge, you've been a great advocate for families and friends, and you know so much. So I said, just do it. And so Margie picked up the phone, and she said yes.
Well, you never ever say no to Sandy. I think you sort of get that feeling, don't you? You wouldn't dare say no. Okay, so I said yes, I would help her with it. And then the first thing, of course, was each of the interviews that she did was at least 2.5 hours long.
Oh, long.
So we had this mountain of interviews, and we employed somebody to help us with the transcripts because there was no way known we could do it all ourselves. So we paid to have the transcripts done. And then we had all of this information, mountains and mountains of it. And at that stage I thought, what on earth are we going to do with all of this? So I sat down and I thought about it, and I thought, well, what's really important from Sandy's point of view was that the nurses at Larundel and the patients had the closest connection with each other, because the nurses were with you 24/7. And I thought, well, obviously Sandy is, and we now say consumer rather than patient, but that's another...
Language is fascinating.
We'll talk about language in a moment, yes. So I said, Sandy, I think you write up all of the consumers or patients or inmates, as Sandy called them, and the nurses, because that's where the closest connection is. And because I originally trained as an occupational therapist, I said, I will do all the interviews with the staff. So Sandy interviewed psychiatrists, nurses, oh no, she was going to do the nurses, psychiatrists, social workers, psychologists, occupational therapists, and also chaplains. So I wrote, and then Sandy interviewed some families as well. And because my whole life's work really has been helping to find ways of supporting families coping with schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. So that's how we divvied up the work. So Sandy wrote nurses and inmates, and I did all of the others. And that actually worked very well, didn't it? Because you know, I hadn't worked at Larundel. My original job way back in the mid-1950s was at Royal Park Psychiatric Hospital. Some of you might remember Royal Park, do you? It became the centre for the Commonwealth Games.
Yeah, the village, the athletes' village.
The athletes' village, that's right. And now, of course, it's all been, most of it given over for real estate. Yes, so, but that's how the book came to be written. But I think the interesting thing too, as we were writing up the book, Sandy and I, of course, came across areas where we were initially at loggerheads. But I think one of the things that we have work to do, and what a lot of people are saying is helping them, is Sandy coming from the perspective of somebody who's had an illness and has had to cope with the stigma of mental illness, which is still the worst stigma anybody can hold on to, which upsets me no end. I keep on thinking, are we making progress there? I don't know. So we then found Sandy was a bit worried about my obsession with helping the families. Do you want to say a little bit about that bit there? I mean, these are some of the issues we have to cope with ourselves.
In a way, we're a microcosm. The macrocosm is that in the mental health world, there's a huge spat between carers and consumers. Politically, they're very much not aligned with each other, and they should be. But there's a lot of antagonism between carers and consumers, partly because for people who have a mental illness, being cared for is in a way a powerless position for you sometimes, because you lose your agency, you lose the capacity to make decisions, you lose the ability to take risks in your life, and so you become disempowered by your illness, which is a really sad thing. And if you politicise that disempowerment, it becomes a spat between carers and consumers in the mental health world. And a lot of consumers see carers getting gigs on government agencies for consultation, and all these things that happen. And they said the carers get all the gigs and the consumers don't get the same gigs. So there's this sort of disempowerment happening with consumers. And so we're a microcosm of that. But the thing is,
can I add there?
Yes,
Sorry, and you know how we interrupt each other the
Yes.
whole time, and that still continues. But I was finding a vast number of family carers whose sons and daughters, particularly, were so unwell that they could not speak for themselves, and they needed somebody to speak for them, and the families wanted to help them and support them and do the very best that they could. So
yes, it's just a shame.
it's just a great shame,
Yeah.
in fact, that there is this historical. I think it's changing now. That's one of the things that they're really working very hard towards, and why I think Sandy and I, as a sort of coming from different perspectives and still being friends with
We're
each
still friends.
other, and
After writing the book, after this, we're still friends.
and
Yeah.
sorting it through. It's a bit of an example
Yeah.
that we don't have to have this continuing conflict.
Yeah. Language changes all the time.
So one of the things that I had to cope with Sandy, she said, right, we're going to call this Out of the Madhouse. And I said, I'm not going to be an author of a book that's got Madhouse in the title. I'm just not going to be. I don't like it. And what we were trying to do at the time of Larundel was trying to change from being the big bad institution to be innovative and to bring in all the new things that we were discovering were needed. So Larundel was trying to change. And part of that change was the language. We didn't want to call it a loony bin. You know, all the pejorative terms that were given to the big institutions.
The bug house, the rat factory.
Yes, all of those
All
things.
those, yeah.
And we wanted to call it a psychiatric hospital. Well, of course, nowadays, to call something psychiatric is almost equally as bad as it being a loony bin, because, we've still got this enormous stigma associated with anything to do with mental illness. So Sandy wanted them to call them inmates, and I said, no, we were saying that people in a psychiatric hospital were unwell. They weren't mad, they weren't crazy. These were people who had a genuine illness, so they were to be patients. You wouldn't have a bar of that. You said they still had to be inmates.
And I said inmates because I thought that once you're in Larundel, it was a total experience. You're totally consumed by that experience being in there, and your life was taken over, and you were part of that thing. As a total institution, you're a total inmate.
Yes.
So that's why I use inmate as always, also as a political statement as well, just to say this is a place where people lost their agency and lost their will.
That's right. And I just want to finish by saying that you notice how Sandy won?
I was going to say, Sandy's obviously very persuasive because the title of the book.
Sorry,
and it's all about inmates inside, though when I write my chapters, they're called patients.
Except
Her chapters are inmates, but my chapters
See,
are
the thing
patients.
is, with language though, where we went from being lunatics to patients to clients to consumers, and some people refer to themselves as survivors, so they're ex-patients or ex-survivors or survivors, or what's the other term they use? The language is evolving all the time. This is the fascinating thing about mental health. There's no set term anymore. It's always evolving. Even the word consumer has its own issues, because I hate consumer. What are we consuming? It's like you're buying a product. You're supposed to be,
Are you buying the schizophrenia?
yeah, exactly.
Does it come on a shelf?
And the idea of they're using consumer was that you're supposed to have some power in that relationship, that you're paying. You could choose a service. You're paying for a service that you're choosing to use. And I hate it. I hate that word. It's just so economic.
Because that's not the case with mental illness.
No, and it's just economic rationalism on steroids. So I hate it. But I use inmates. Well, I prefer to say I'm Sandy. Actually, I mean, who am I? I'm not a consumer. I'm Sandy.
Yes, Sandy. Right.
So language is fascinating. It's a moving feast.
Yes, I say. And from an historical point of view, I think it's very interesting to look at how language changes. And the meanings that go behind those changes. You know, we were desperately trying to get people with a mental illness accepted as having an illness that was not their fault. I mean, so the language changed to try and reflect that.
But even in the mental health world, though, we can't agree on whether it's an illness or not. So there's even contention around whether schizophrenia is real. Is it a mental illness or not? Because there's no known cause of schizophrenia. Therefore, there's no cure. So if you don't know the cause, is it real? So people contend even that. We can't even agree in the consumer world whether it's a mental illness or a condition or what. It's all because psychiatry as a discipline is predicated on the idea that a diagnosis is made on the basis of the interpretation and observation of someone's words and actions. And when you have, it is not a complete, definite science. When you're relying on your interpretation of someone's words and actions, you're open to all sorts of critiques and criticisms because it's not perfect and it gets it wrong often.
We found ourselves asking the question, what have we gained by closing the big hospitals? And what we actually found ourselves saying, hey, but listen, we really believe that we have lost a lot that was really quite good about the big institutions. So let's move on to that bit, Sandy.
Okay.
What have we gained by closing a big place like Larundel and Mon Park and Janefield and what was the other one? Plenty, that's right, yes, the Psychopolis on these.
It was called.
Yes, okay. So do you want to start with that then?
Yes, we'll start with what we lost. So I think one of the biggest things we've lost by closing Larundel and all those places was the notion of asylum. Because they were called asylums. And this notion of asylum has now been demonised and toxified by the debate we have over asylum seekers being queue jumpers and whatever they are. They're here under spurious circumstances. So the idea of asylum is to have a safe haven away from the world where you can recover your wellness and well-being. And in a way, Larundel did give you some asylum with the gardens for a start. You were there for not just a week or 10 days, you were there for as long as you needed to be there to get well. So there was no constraints on that. And in a way, it gave you the space and the time to find your equilibrium and your sanity. And we don't have that now in our mental health system at all. You go to a psych ward, it has a courtyard with fake grass where all the smokers go. And you're there for 10 days maybe if you're lucky, and you're pushed out mad because someone mad who needs your bed basically. And they don't even pretend to offer people asylum in these psych wards because they're so hyped up on despair, on steroids, and people there on ice benders. And the whole these places are traumatising. They're not healing at all, and they don't even pretend to offer you asylum. In a way, Larundel, with its open wards, did offer people asylum. And people, one guy in the book called it the Bundoora Country Club. He loved Larundel. He had a great time there. And for him, it was a place where he could be and find his solitude and find some healing. So we lost that with the closure of Larundel. We lost the apprenticeship model of nursing. In Larundel, they had the Muriel Yarrington School of Nursing, and people would train there for 3 years to be a psychiatric nurse, and in that training you trained on the job. You were in the wards from day one and being with the patients. And this apprenticeship model prepared people for a life of psychiatric nursing. And so it wasn't where you go to a university, do a degree, then you do an add-on of a few months of to do your psychiatric nursing component. Then you get to a psych ward and you think, God, this is so awful. I can't bear this place. It's too traumatising for me. I'm not going to work here. So people aren't prepared to go into a psych ward now. And when they do go to a psych ward, they're so hyped up on steroids with despair that they can't deal with it. So we've lost the apprenticeship model of nursing, and that went with Larundel. And that was very sad because a lot of people don't get good nursing practice training at all.
I think the other thing, particularly from my viewpoint as an occupational therapist, at Larundel you got your medical care, but you also got psychological help and what I call social help. And it was all under the one roof. So you were looked after medically, clinically, but then every day you had a range of activities. So you'd go to the occupational therapy department and you do a lot of the things that occupational therapists did in those days, a lot of craft work. But there was also something called industrial therapy, which is where you went and you did fairly boring things like putting light bulbs into little plastic packages or whatever. But the whole idea was that this was part of retraining for you, that when you did leave the hospital, you would go out and you would have skills that were able for you to go back to being employed or to go back to being a student or whatever it was, so that you did then have what is now termed a meaningful life. Now, nowadays, a lot of those sort of services just simply do not exist anymore. They've been defunded. All the money in Victoria particularly has gone to the NDIS. So a lot of those services that I set up when we started the Schizophrenia Fellowship, where people could go and have skills relearnt to help them get back into a meaningful life, that's all gone. During COVID, just on one day, I took myself off into the city, just called a tram, and wandered around the city of Melbourne. I came back so depressed because there were so many homeless, mentally ill people in Melbourne streets. I was just shattered. I really was. If we had Larundel, we wouldn't have that now. We just wouldn't. So they received all of their services under the one roof and at the same time and for as long as was needed. So Sandy and I felt ourselves saying, we have to get this out, we have to write about this and just try and show people that what we've got at the moment is really pretty bad.
I think because people demonise places like Larundel endlessly. The closure of them was based on the parameters of the anti-psychiatry movement critiquing it. Reformers wanting to sell land off and have some sort of Pollyanna system that was going to be fantastic, because just by closing the hospitals, I thought they were going to make a better system. You know, we just close these naughty hospitals, what's going to come next is going to be much better. Well, 20 years down the track, we're having a Royal Commission. So clearly there are problems. So we wanted to say that Larundel, it wasn't perfect, but it was a complex institution which had some good sides and some bad sides. And I think what we tried to do in our book was to not be just demonising the place, but to show the paradoxes and the complexities and how it wasn't all bad, it wasn't all good. And I think one of the things that came out of Larundel that was important, though, was that places like Larundel was the development and formation of the consumer and carer movements. So in the 1970s, lots of there's movements springing up on the basis of the civil rights movements and the gay pride movement and the feminist movement. A lot of people who had been in hospitals banded together and created the consumer movement. And that was a consequence of places like Larundel and even the carer movement as well.
Well, that's why I started the Schizophrenia Fellowship. I did a PhD in sociology in later life, and my PhD was, I went out, it was at the time we were closing all the big hospitals, and I was concerned about what was really happening for the families, because the closing of the big hospitals meant that the care of the family member with mental illness became the pretty well total responsibility of their family. And as I was doing my research, I followed a number of families over a period of 3 to 4 years. Halfway through my research, I had to give it away because I was so distressed by what the families were being asked to do. They were still being blamed for causing schizophrenia. That's still around a lot, which absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Masses of research has been done. No evidence for blaming families. Anyway, after 2 years, after a year away from it, I thought, no, I've got to go back and finish this PhD. So I did. And the end of finishing that, I left Monash University and went out and we started the Schizophrenia Fellowship, which was started by family carers because they were saying, we've got to do something. Nothing is happening. So that was the beginning of the family carer movement as well. And one of the really good things that's happened in our services now is that family carers are being employed and consumers are being employed in our mental health services. So the voices of the people who matter most in all of this are really being heard and taken into account. And that's been really really positive.
It's called co-design,
Co-design.
co-production. That's the
Yes.
buzzword now. Co-design, co-production, and peer-led stuff is
yes.
another
Yes.
buzzword. And lived experience is another buzzword. Capital L, capital E. So there are buzzwords all around. Like like mindfulness is another buzzword.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Okay. Well, this is language again.
The language, this language. Yeah, but peer support and peer-led.
Yes.
Yeah, it's all about
Thanks.
that.
Now, the things that that Larundel was really good at, how do we get those into our mental health services now? And that is the very, very big question. The idea that what would help enormously would be if people with mental illness were given supported housing. They wouldn't be homeless. And I did a study because we set up one of these accommodation facilities at the Schizophrenia Fellowship. I had it evaluated, and we were able to show just how much money it saved the government if you put people into supported housing. If you don't put them in supported housing, they roam the streets of Melbourne, cost a lot of money because the police are always having to do this, that and the other, or they commit minor crimes because they're hungry and they can't get food, so they're put in jail. And how much does jail cost a day? I mean, it's ludicrous.
More than the Hilton Hotel.
Exactly. So if you put people into social housing, it would be much less expensive,
Well,
and they would start to have a decent
A
life.
place to call home.
A place to call-
basically.
right.
It sounds so silly. Because a place to call home is so important. You can have friends there, you have a pet, you can have maybe cook some decent food. Who knows? But a place to call home is such a boon for someone's existence, and to not have that when you're mentally ill is a pathway to illness, hospitalisation, and just being a psych patient, being in and out of hospital just as a psych patient.
And obviously that's what Larundel provided.
Yeah, that's right.
It did for some, and it was a community for some people too. Those people in the back wards who were there for years had a community there.
Yeah.
And when it was closed down, this is really sad. That they were assured that they were going to have accommodation when it was closed down. And they moved into some CCUs, community care units. Then the government decided after 2 years, no, you've got to leave because you can't stay here any longer. And a lot of the nurses were very angry, including Bill, very angry at the way these long-term patients were treated by the government when they put them into these CCUs and then moved them on. And the point is they went to sort of special accommodation places where they became cash cows for the unethical landlords of these places who just used them as a cash cow and didn't care about their well-being. So it's really quite sad. But we're not saying no, go back to Larundel. We aren't saying go back to Larundel. We can't go back there. It's impossible. But we just haven't learnt from what we could use from Larundel that is really productive and good. And in a way, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And this whole idea of care in the community,
Still
sort
care
of
by families.
care by families, and the community doesn't actually care. The community hates mental patients, and the way the media treat us is appalling. And all it does is just raise fear and loathing in the populace for people with schizophrenia. So we do show the day-to-day living of Larundel there, all the things that are happening day to day, what it was like as a madhouse. I mean, it's just in a way. There's no other book that I know of that takes you into the heart of a madhouse the way we have done so, and it's through the eyes and through the voices of the people who were there. And that's the important part of this oral history, is that it's an authentic oral history with about 15 patients or something, ex-patients, and for them it was a harder thing to recollect because their memories were painful for them. That's
what I was thinking.
But they were very gracious in talking to me. I have to really commend them that they sat there and I asked, because I'd been there too. I sort of knew what to ask and how to ask the questions because I had that empathy with them. So they were very, very giving of their experiences and but the nurses had the most to say, I have to say, because and for the nurses, the place was for them it was. They had a fabulous time there. They had the camaraderie, they had the pantomimes, they had so much going for them at the place, and a lot of them worked there their entire working lives. Like some nurses have been there 20, 30 years. And so in a way, Larundel for them was like a home, and it was a family, and in a way they were institutionalised like the patients were.
Well, you had a nurses' home there anyway, didn't you?
There was over the road there was
the
a nurses' home there.
Yes, that's right.
And when they trained there, they lived there as well. So the nurses had a much different experience to the patients. The psychiatrists were, I did about 5 psychiatrists, I think. They were very happy to talk about it.
Yeah, can I talk a little bit about the psychiatrists?
Yes, you can.
Because I think when, if you get round to reading the book and you read what the psychiatrists had to say, you get a lovely feeling about what the psychiatrists were trying to do and the problems that they faced as well. And one of the worst things, and the nurses didn't like it either, was when somebody was really out of control and you really had to, lock them up and put them in seclusion and restraint. And the nurses and the psychiatrists talk about how incredibly difficult and awful that was to do, and they wished that they didn't have to do it. And the medications that were coming in, the medications had terrible side effects.
Horrible.
And they talk a lot about the fact that the treatments that they had available for their use, they knew they were inadequate. They weren't going to make really huge differences to people. But that's all they had.
That's all they had, yeah.
And the psychiatrist said, in many ways, they are equally as stigmatised as the patients because they're psychiatrists.
And working in Larundel.
And working in Larundel as well. So you must be something pretty wrong with you if you want to go and work in that crazy place.
Yeah.
So the stigma for everybody was there, really, wasn't it?
But the people had the best things to say about Larundel were the chaplains. Their recollections are so beautiful. There's David Leach, who was there from 87 to 95, and he says that for him Larundel was a place of authenticity because there was no bullshit there. The patients were there in a really basic primal state, and that for him his interaction with the patients was so authentic and so for him revelatory because he learnt so much from the patients and he saw so much authenticity with them. So for him, Larundel was a place that was of the imagination, he called it, a place of the imagination. And to him it was a really, a very seminal part of his working life as a chaplain was to be at Larundel. And then he had other chaplains who had similar experiences, but the chaplains had the most wonderful recollections, I have to say, and they're just beautiful.
But the consumers, inmates, your word, also said that the chaplains listened to them. Now, the chaplains didn't have any training in psychology or psychiatry or anything. Their greatest skill was to listen.
And they weren't there to diagnose.
And and they didn't have to put somebody into seclusion and restraint, so they could actually just listen. But that really is what we're finding now when I talk to lots and lots of families and to consumers as well. Many of them will say, this is the first time somebody's listened. I haven't been listened to, nobody listens. So the chaplains taught us that it was just incredibly important to listen.
The Royal Commission is very medically based, more beds, more hospital beds, more money for clinical services. There's not enough being given to the social aspect of people's recovery. And is there any money going to supported accommodation? None that I know of. So in a way, the money might go to the wrong place. I'm not sure. We have to wait and see. But the medical model, for a lot of people with mental illness, the medical model, which is just pumping you full of drugs, is so inadequate. And so not ministering to the rest of your whole being, like the holistic healing of your heart and soul and creativity and, doing something which is productive in your life and having hope, meaning and purpose. The medical model doesn't minister to hope, meaning and purpose. It only ministers to putting more drugs in you. So a lot of my contemporaries and my mad comrades, as I call them, are feeling quite frustrated. My mad comrades are feeling quite frustrated by the Royal Commission and its medical model focus. So what will really happen, we don't know. We'll see. And in a way, they're shackled to the bricks and mortar they have, which are the inadequate psych wards in the back of a hospital in the car park, where the carpet ends and the linoleum starts. And we're shackled to that model still. We need to.
When did it close? What was it?
It closed in 1999. I wanted to honour its history, and by honouring its history through the voices of people who were there, I thought that was the best way of keeping the notion of it alive. I wanted to keep Larundel alive in the public's imagination.
Because it was trying to change as well.
Well, in a way, and also we write about it during the 70s and early 80s mostly because that's when people were there that are interviewed, and the 70s and 80s were the golden age of Larundel, when it was seen as a place of innovation and optimism, when things were happening there that were quite innovative and really progressive ways of dealing with mental illness. And the golden years were important because it had some really good stuff going for it. And I wanted to just remind people that these things were happening, that it had this side to it that wasn't all bad. And it's just my personal association with it, because I was so in a way changed by my time there, and I was so affected by it. I thought we have to remember that it existed, because you say Larundel now to people, they go, what was that? Like they don't, even in mental health, people in mental health don't know what Larundel was.
Yeah.
And so if you have no history of your discipline, where are you going to go in the future? You've got to remember the past to go into the future. So that's why I wanted to write about Larundel.
Yes, and in you writing about it, but you also found so many of the consumers and the people that you interviewed also said very positive things.
Some people did. I mean, there's
the
really
negative as well.
Yeah, there's trauma. There's very traumatic stuff in there that people experience, but there's also the guys going to Bandura Country Club. So it was a paradoxical place. It had so many paradoxical things about it. It was quite extraordinary. But I didn't want to just do a diatribe against it. I wanted to show the good and the bad.